Okay, there's one last point before we turn it over to discussion. One last thing I forgot to mention. So after the section of the paper that we've just been through in detail, Ray goes on to give his reasons for thinking that as he sees it, the self-deceptions of religion are not benign. So remember I said before, he does have this view that a certain amount of self-deception can be a good thing. Right? In fact, maybe it's sort of constitutive of what we view as mental health, that you are self-deceived in certain respects. But he says there are reasons for thinking that the self-deceptions of religion are not benign, that they actually have pernicious consequences. In particular, he worries about the use of religious arguments in ethics and psychology. He thinks that in these domains you often get pernicious arguments from religious premises. So an example that he would, I can't remember whether he uses this example, but think of the Pope's opposition to the distribution of condoms in Africa to combat AIDS. Right, that's a kind of example that Ray would point to and say, that's an example where we see that the self-deception of religion is not benign. The other case that he talks about, that he makes quite a bit of, is he says that religious beliefs give rise to oversimplified understandings, particularly of conflicts and troubles. So, for example, think of George W. Bush's famous remarks about the axis of evil, right? Understanding political disputes in those terms tends only to make things worse. And again, that's something that Ray wants to sheet home to religious belief. So they're the kinds of reasons that Ray gives for thinking that it actually matters, that we're not just talking about a positive or a benign self-deception, but that it's actually pernicious. Okay, so let's go back. There's a whole lot of a whole lot of reasons that Ray thinks help to establish that religious belief must rest in self-deception. The question is this a persuasive case? Are the details persuasive? Where do you want to disagree with Ray? Where do you think his case is weak? Where do you think his case is just completely mistaken? What do you think about it? So over to you. Yep.
I think this case is weakened by point number 11, the portrayal by reactions and behaviour.
Mm-hmm.
He chooses not to explain why people might be saddened by the death of a loved one. I can believe that someone's going to paradise, that I might be joining them in 2 years' time, but I could still miss them for those 2 years and still be sad about that.
Right, so if somebody's going overseas for a period of time, it's true that you'll miss them, but you probably won't go into mourning. You won't behave in the way that we typically do when somebody dies. So Ray's not disputing that, you know, being apart from somebody that you love for 2 periods is significant, right? It's just, but what he was claiming in that with this example is that the way that it is appropriate to act if someone's just going to be away for 2 years is the way that you should respond when somebody dies. If you really believe, I mean, maybe it's slightly more complicated because rarely do you know that you're going to be dead within 2 years as well, but we can imagine a case that was like that. You've got an inoperable condition of some kind. The prognosis is you're almost certainly going to be dead within 2 years. Now your partner's just died, right? You meant to think, well, that's really like being apart for 2 years. It's not like it's not something that you should go in for extravagant mourning over. That's Ray's suggestion. it seems unfair to me in another way, which is that even if there's some uncertainty, you might be pretty sure that you're going to be dead as well within 2 years. Whether you're going to go to heaven or not, and even if you believe that there is such a thing as heaven, you might think is really seriously in doubt. And maybe you think you're going to end up in different places for eternity, all right? One of you in hell, the other one in heaven. And that would be something to feel quite anxious about, I think. So, and if you take the view, you say it's sort of taking it over literally, but even if you take it very literally, it's not at all obvious that there's something sort of unreasonable about being very anxious about what's happened when somebody died, because there's so much that's at stake. So one of the things that you're suggesting is that if somebody just believes what are the received religious views of their community or their culture, because there are various authority figures who tell them, right, and then they don't examine it at all, right, in any respect, because they just believe it in the same way you believe what your teachers tell you about everything else. So part of the idea here is that this is a kind of as philosophers typically do, because we spend so much time talking about reasons and arguments and evidence, it's sort of overly rational conception of belief, right? And it's not that that your mother, when she was 15, that all of this stuff that Ray takes to be obvious had any sort of impact on her at all. She had her religious belief, and since none of these other considerations had arisen, there wasn't even a question of self-deception. It wasn't that there was this stuff that she had to be pushing aside. Now, what might Ray say to that? I mean, take what he says about so if you believe the gospel stories, isn't it sort of obvious that you can't heal people by touching them, for example, that somehow or other there's something just unbelievable about that, and Ray might try saying. But I don't see why she would have had to deny that. Of course, if you know, someone down the street had started saying, well, you know, I can heal people by cure them of cancer by touching them, she wouldn't have believed it, just like everybody else wouldn't have believed it. Right? So it's not clear. I think I agree with what you're saying. It's just not clear that you're going to be able to make this charge stick. Now, I didn't read out this bit, but in order to indicate the full range of what Ray thinks he's arguing about, he says, anybody with a standard American high school education will recognise in these 11 reasons, good reasons for thinking that religious belief really is self-deception. So this is a sort of interesting response to Ray, I think, and it, I think, goes back to the question about exactly what he's trying to do. So he's going to rely on a whole lot of things that seem evident to him, right? And then against that background, he has this story to tell about religious believers. If you're a religious believer and you rely on a whole lot of things that seem obvious to you, you may actually be able to tell a very similar story. It's just that you're holding fixed different things, right? So that was sort of one thought that I'd had about this. But I mean, there's sort of more detailed suggestion is that actually, if you're a religious believer, you could say a lot of these things about non-believers and their reasons for being non-believers. And it occurs to me that an interesting thing to do will be to go back to the 16th, 17th and 18th century writers who denied that there were any non-believers and look to see whether they used any of, this is something I haven't done, look to see whether they used any of these very same arguments. I suspect that they did use some of them. Okay, so these things that seem obvious might seem obvious to Ray because there's a whole lot of stuff that he's accumulated over the years, but they're not going to seem obvious to other people, and so you don't have to turn around and say that the child's self-deceived when it takes on the beliefs, because it's not that there's some level at which the child knows really that these things are false, because that's ultimately Ray's claim, that religious believers all know at some level that the things that they believe aren't really true. That's what the self-deception's supposed to be. Right? And to take account of children, Ray's claim was his claim's only about adults. So he says by the time you've finished a high school education, if you're a normal person, right, so we're supposing you're not, that you don't have some serious brain damage or something like that, so long as you're a normal person, there'll be a level at which you know that religious beliefs are false. That's his claim. So children's a different story, because yes, children initially something closer to a sort of blank slate, and they pick up the beliefs of their parents. But by the time they've had a decent education, by the time they're 18, Ray thinks it's not going to be like that. Right, and there's a way in which at one point, when he's talking about detail resistance, Ray says, of course, in theology there are lots of details, but then what he goes on to say is the details aren't connected to evidence in the right kind of way. But that actually seems to me to be kind of beside the point, right? Because that's just bringing in his sort of external view about the falsity of all the religious beliefs. But we're supposed to be arguing about the people being self-deceived in their religious believings. That's supposed to be his thesis, right? So if there is lots of detail in theological works, if you can go to your pastor and you get all the details, it feels as though the claim that you must be self-deceived has now been undercut. So, yeah. Right, and I wanted to run a different example, so pick somebody like Richard Swinburne or Alvin Plantinga, who's written a whole series of books explaining why they believe that God exists. It's very hard, I think, to make the charge stick that they're self-deceived and there's some deep level at which they don't believe that God exists. I mean, this self-deception would have to be really hard to find, wouldn't it? If it was true that Plantinga and Swinburne and people like that, or pick some theologians, like Alistair McGrath or somebody like that. It just, on the face of it, that just seems like an incredibly implausible claim. I think that there's some level at which they know that God doesn't exist. Nonetheless, they go on writing book after book, arguing for the existence of God or arguing for things that presuppose the existence of God. That's something else that's interesting. He primarily argues about the claim that God exists, but officially his target is religious, specifically religious doctrines. So I think he would say that belief in reincarnation and karma goes exactly the same way as belief in God. Right, so it's just, he talks about God because he's an American writing in America, and the people that the religious people that he's familiar with are all Christians. But I reckon he thinks that this is perfectly general. And it might be that there are some philosophers, so Aristotle might be an example of a philosopher who in some sense believed that there was a God and believed nothing about God, thought God was completely disengaged from the world. But what you get from that is philosophy. It's not really religion at all. It had no consequences for how he lived. I'm assuming that Ray thinks that if they're going to be religious beliefs, it's not just belief in something supernatural, but belief in something supernatural that in somehow or other is going to impact on your behaviour. Because I know if there's a kind of philosophical sort of thought, I believe that there's something that caused the universe, and I'm not prepared to go in for any speculation about its moral nature or its further properties and so on. Feels to me like that's not religion at all yet. So I think he might say something like that. Okay, let me ask you a question about the betrayal by reactions and behaviour again. So when I talked to Ray, he said when he makes these sorts of points to Christians that he knows, to religious believers that he knows, they shuffle their feet and they look at the floor, and he interprets their behaviour as a sort of indication that they don't really believe the things that they're saying, because that kind of reaction could be prompted by they're not really believing it. But what else could prompt that kind of behaviour? Okay, so I'm interested in the last thing you said, that they're embarrassed, because one explanation for why they're embarrassed is because they can't think of something to say in response, but there might be other reasons why they're embarrassed too. So another reason why they might feel embarrassed is just because this is a subject matter that they don't feel comfortable about talking to him, particularly given that he's not a particularly sympathetic listener. So what else might it be? I mean, something else that occurs to me, suppose he's talking to Plantinga. Now, Plantinga might be embarrassed for Ray because he just knows so little about contemporary philosophy of religion, and he knows so little about contemporary theology, and there are all these things that are just sort of obvious that Ray doesn't know, and he's giving these horribly bad arguments, right? And I think if the situation, there's a kind of symmetry here. Right, so at least in some cases I'd be prepared to bet if Ray was interrogating philosophers of religion who are Christians, that it would actually be that was going on. Okay, let me ask you about something that happened quite early on. The patent weakness of religious arguments. So Ray thinks that it's just obvious, say, that the arguments for the existence of God are bad in ways that high school students could spot, right? I mean, sorry, if you'd reached the end of your high school education, you could just spot what was wrong with the arguments, or you could spot that they were bad arguments. Now, some of you may have actually looked at some of the arguments. Does that seem plausible to you? Maybe nobody's looked at the arguments, and so I'm kind of going off on a kind of wrong tack at this point. But consider, let me give you just one example. So, the greatest logician of the 20th century, possibly the greatest logician of all time, is Kurt Gödel. And some of you will have heard of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, for example. Now, Gödel was very interested in philosophy. He was particularly interested in Leibniz's philosophy, and obviously he felt a certain affinity with Leibniz. One of the things that Leibniz did was he reworked Descartes' ontological argument because he thought that there was something wrong with Descartes' argument that he could fix. Gödel looked at Leibniz's version of the argument and wasn't entirely satisfied with it, but he came up with one of his own. So Gödel has a proof of the existence of God, and because it's Gödel's proof, it's fairly long and it's fairly complicated, and there's nothing wrong with any of the steps of reasoning in the proof, and the premises are complicated and they're not entirely easy to assess either. Now, I reckon that your average person with high school education would be completely at a loss to assess Gödel's ontological argument. They couldn't tell you whether it was valid or not. They couldn't tell you whether the premises are true or not. They couldn't tell you whether it was a convincing argument or not.
Is that more the exception rather than the rule, whereas I think you just learned it through basics?
Okay, so that's a fair question. So let me start on something a bit indirect and then come back to that. For years, for centuries, mathematicians have specialised in producing proofs that 0 equals 1. Right? This is a joke. It's a game. Usually it involves a point where you cancel out zeros, right? So you've got 0 over 0, but you cancel them out, right, at some point in the proof. But there are more and more subtle ways that you can do this. And mathematicians could give you a proof that 0 equals 1, and you would not be able to find the flaw in it, right? And over time, as I said, mathematicians have just got better and better at doing this. Now, I think that something similar happens with arguments for and against the existence of God. So, over time, people devise arguments that it's harder and harder to spot what's gone wrong with them. Right? It doesn't mean that the arguments are getting better. But it does mean that for someone who doesn't specialise in logic and philosophy of language and other areas in philosophy, it's much harder to assess whether what you've got is a good argument or not. And so, to answer your question, I don't think that it's the rule that Gödel's argument is particularly an exception to the rule. If you look at recent versions of, on the one hand, ontological arguments, cosmological arguments, arguments for design, on the other hand, problem of evil, problem of hiddenness, incoherence arguments about God, they get more and more sophisticated, more and more complicated, harder to assess as time goes by. I reckon that in actual fact, your average high school student would have very little chance of giving an adequate assessment of the arguments for the about the existence of God as they now stand. And this sort of comes back to the point that was made before, that those arguments really have got nothing much to do one way or another with reasons that people have for believing in God or not believing in God, and you could hardly accuse them of self-deception if they didn't have an opinion about Gödel's ontological argument or some of these other arguments. So that, of the things that I've listed here, there's probably some more things to say about detail resistance. So Ray says it's really curious that people don't ask questions like, what's the mechanism when God says, let there be light, and there's light? I mean, for a start, how could God say anything given that God's immaterial? But what's the mechanism? How does it happen? What are the details? How exactly does your immaterial, omnipotent and omniscient being make it the case that a universe appears? And Ray says there's lots of other details in creation stories in religions or other things in religion. And people just aren't curious about the details. Now, my question really is, how might you explain that? Why aren't people, let's suppose that Ray's right, and there is this kind of detail resistance, and religious believers typically, when Ray asks for more details, they just shrug their shoulders. What would justify them in doing that? Okay, so Ray's puzzled about why you might have the it doesn't matter attitude, because, you know, I mean, does it really matter what the universe was like in the first 5 minutes? To most of us, most of the time, not at all, but there are some physicists who are sort of passionately interested in trying to figure that out. It doesn't feel as though there's anybody who's passionately trying to figure out how God's saying, let there be light, was followed by light appearing. What was the causal mechanism that made this happen? I mean, that's Ray's example, but you can sort of think of other cases. It seems to me, that there's a different answer, which is that the details, there's no way that we can figure out the details, and we can see in advance that there's no way that we can figure it out, right? You can't. We think that hypotheses about the first 5 minutes of the universe, ultimately we can test them. We can build big particle accelerators, we can smash particles together, we can see what happens, right? There's a way of confirming hypotheses. Any hypothesis that you make about God's activities prior to the Big Bang and the causation that's involved, right, is going to be, at the best, it's going to be just sheer speculation. There's no way that you can test it out. You might think that unless we get a revelation from God, there's lots of stuff we can't possibly know. Right? We can't know how God does it. We can't figure it out for ourselves. Right? And we can't figure it out empirically. Right? The empirical stuff is we can make observations about what happened after the Big Bang, but we can't observe what happened before. Right? We may know some stuff about what happened before, but only because God saw fit to tell us what it was. The rest of it we can't get at. So the reason why the detail resistance isn't surprising in some cases, and the reason why religious believers don't care about it, is because on their theory they predict, really, that these details aren't going to be known. Right? And so that would be a different answer, I think, to Ray, and one that would have a fair bit of plausibility in some cases. It's not surprising that they just shrug their shoulders and they feel embarrassed for Ray when he pursues this line of questioning, because presumably it's so obvious what the answer is. We don't know, we can't know, so what? There was one last issue that I wanted to spend some time thinking about, and that's in general about sort of charging people with really at some level knowing something's not the case when nonetheless they say that it is. How does that work? How could that work? Right? So, and we are used to the idea that people can be self-deceived, but self-deception's kind of a funny notion to start with. How exactly does it work? How can you, and literally, how can you trick yourself, right? but even thinking about it sort of less literally than that, how can it be that you take yourself to believe something and yet there's a level at which you believe the opposite? What model of psychology could make sense of that? So that's something to think about. But also, what sort of evidence would you need in order to make charges of self-deception stick? That one though would be, false beliefs can be explained in various kinds of ways. Self-deception isn't having a false belief, and it might be that hysterical pregnancy is just having a false belief, right? You falsely believe that you're pregnant when you're not. And okay, there's this other bit of the story that is sort of obvious to everybody else, right, that you're not. But you can't see it, you've just got a bunch of false beliefs. Self-deception's more than that. It's got to be that somehow or other there are two different levels to your cognitive system, whatever, and there are opposed beliefs at the two levels. So you say that God exists at some, presumably if you say that God exists, there's some level at which you believe it, but on Ray's story, there's some other level, a deeper level, at which you really know it's not the case. Now, there are sort of questions about, I think, some questions about how to understand people in terms that will make Ray's story fit to them. Now, maybe they're not insuperable difficulties. Maybe, for example, we do want to believe that people can be self-deceived in that way about some things. So there's a level, so you might sometimes say, well, you know, I went around saying this, but deep down I knew that it wasn't true. But whether we should interpret that literally, so thinking that really there was sort of part of your belief system where you had the belief, and then there's another part of your belief system where you had the opposite belief, which is what Ray's saying about religious believers. I am wondering a little bit whether we should ever say that about people, whether we can really make sense of that. But that's maybe that's a different issue for another day. Okay, so we've reached the end of this session, and we've reached the end of this section of the course. What we're going to go on to talk about next is some questions about the properties of God and whether we can make sense of these properties. So we're going to start off next time, if I remember the schedule right, we're going to talk about omnipotence and some puzzles about omnipotence.